slides are visible. So we were discussing about different classification techniques, okay? And in today's lecture, we'll discuss some advanced topics and advanced methods for classification. These include Bayesian belief networks and the classification by backpropagation, which is a type of neural network technique. Then we have classification using support vector machines, then frequent patterns, lazy learners, other classification methods, and some additional topics. Okay, so Bayesian belief is also known as a Bayesian network or probabilistic network, and it allows class conditional dependencies between subsets or variables. So we have two components, a directed cyclic graph, and a set of conditional probabilities or CPTs, conditional probability tables. So a directed cyclic graph model causal influence relationship. You can see that in the figure there are nodes which are represented using a random variable, and then there are some links which create dependency between these nodes, and then X and Y are the parents of Z and Y is the parent of P. You can see that the node from where the link is originating, that is the parent, and also there is no dependency between Z and P, and also this graph has no loop or no cycles. This is how Bayesian network and some conditional probability tables look like. You can go through these. So we can have different scenarios for Bayesian network. For example, in scenario when we can have given both the network structure and the variables and all variable observables. And in scenario 2, we have network structure known and some variables are hidden. And in scenario 3, we have network structure which is unknown and all variables are observable. And in scenario 4, we can have unknown structure and all hidden variables are there. So the next type of classifier is known as a backpropagation or a type of which is a type of neural network. And neural networks are those types of classifiers which mimic or which copy the human neurons which are there inside the brain cells. Okay, so brain cells are neurons and they form a network which allows us to think and classify different things. So they try to mimic or duplicate or replicate the same behavior inside the computers. So we have a neural network learning algorithm which is started by psychologists and neurobiologists to develop a test of computation analogous to neurons. So neural network is a set of connected input and output units where each connection has a weight. And during the learning phase, the network learns by adjusting the weights. And we also refer it as connectionist learning. Here's a simple diagram of a neural network. We have a set of inputs, and for example, x0, x1, xn. Then with those inputs, there are some associated weights, w0, w1, and wn. Then there is some activation function, okay, which you can see in the diagram. And this activation function helps this activation function along with the weights. It helps the neural network to learn certain pattern. Okay, for example, an object belongs to class A or class B. So these things helps the neural network to learn. So the inputs to the network, they correspond to the attributes which are there in the problem, and they are fed simultaneously in the units making the input layer. Then there could be some hidden layers, and they are then weighted and fed simultaneously to a hidden layer. So the number of hidden layer is dependent upon the type of network and the type of problem, and the weighted outputs of the last hidden layer are inputs to units making up the output layer. So in feed-forward network, none of the weights cycle back to the input, whereas in backpropagation, the weights they cycle back to the input. Okay, you connect the output again to the input, the output of the weights. Okay, so you can see that we have an input layer and hidden layer, output layer, and there is some activation function which you can see. Now defining the neural network topology. Topology refers to the architecture of the network. So it specifies the number of units in the input layer, the number of hidden layers, the number of units in each hidden layer, and the number of units in the output layer. So we normalize the input layer for each attribute measure in the training tuple. So one input unit per domain value, each can be initialized to 0, and output is there if for classification in more than 2 classes. So once a network has been trained and its accuracy is unacceptable, we can repeat the training process with a different network topology, or we can also use different set of initial weights. Batch propagation is a type of network, as we discussed earlier, that it feeds back the weight to the input, and we iteratively process a set of training tuples and compare the network's prediction with the actual known target value. So for each training tuple, the weights are modified to minimize the mean square error, and then the modifications are made in the backwards direction from the output layer through each hidden layer down to the first hidden layer, and hence we call it a backpropagation network. So there are several steps. For example, initialize the weights, then propagate the input forward, then backpropagate the error, and then there is some termination condition. And neural network has some strengths and weaknesses. For example, the weakness is that it has long training time, it requires a number of parameters, and it has poor interpretability. And the strength of a neural network is that there is high tolerance to noisy data, and the ability to classify untrained patterns is there, and it is well suited for continuous valid inputs and outputs, and it is also successful on an array of real-world data. So we can also use it for parallel processing in the parallel processing applications because they are inherently parallel, and these techniques have recently been developed for the extraction of rules and from the trained neural networks. Excuse me. So the next type of classifier is known as a support vector machine. Support vector machine are a classifier. They are dependent upon different support vectors, which are the data points at the boundary of the two classes. As you can see in the diagram, there are two classes. One is represented by 0, one is represented by x. The data points which are at the boundary of these classes, these are known as support vectors. So the problem is that we want to make a hyperplane. So it's a relatively new classification method for linear and nonlinear data, and it uses a nonlinear mapping to transform the original training data into a higher dimension. And with the new dimension, it searches for the linear optimal separating hyperplane. And the equations, they decide the shape of this hyperplane. And with an appropriate nonlinear mapping to a sufficiently high dimension, data from two classes can always be separated by a hyperplane. And this hyperplane is found using support vectors. So if you look at this diagram, you can see that there are two classes. One on the left is green in green color, and the one on the right is in blue color. So you can see that we can have a boundary of the class, and the task in support vector is to increase this margin or the boundary between two classes. You can see in the first diagram the boundary is very thin, but we adjust the shape or the boundary direction of the boundary, we see that the margin is very large. So the larger the margin is between two classes, the more likely it is that we accurately classify the two things. And you can also see that the boundary data elements are known as support vectors, and they are mentioned there. Okay, then there are some differences between SVM and neural networks, support vector machines and neural networks. SEM are deterministic, where neural networks are non-deterministic. They have nice generalization properties, where neural network generalizes but does not have strong mathematical foundation. SEM is hard to learn, and whereas neural network can easily learn in incremental fashion. Okay, and things like this. Now the next type of classifier is known as frequent pattern type classification, and we know that we have some associative rules, and we mine data to find strong associations between frequent patterns. And why they are effective? Because they explore highly confident associations among multiple attributes and may overcome some constraints. And associative classification also has been found to be often more accurate than the traditional classification methods. Okay, now the task is of feature selection in this, and we have a given set of frequent patterns. So both non-discriminative and redundant patterns exist, which can cause the overfitting. So we want to single out the discriminative patterns and remove the redundant ones, and the notion of maximal marginal relevance is there. So is borrowed. So a document has high marginal relevance if it's both relevant to the query and contains minimal margin similarity to previously selected documents. Then there are some type of learners which are known as lazy learners. They simply store training data and wait until it is given a test tuple. In contrast to the lazy learners, we have eager learners or eager learning. So we have a given set of training tuples. We construct a classification model before receiving new data to classify. And lazy has less time in training but more time in predicting, whereas the eager has more time in training but less time in predicting. So accuracy, lazy method effectively uses a richer hypothesis space since it uses many local linear functions to form an implicit global approximation to the target function, whereas the eager must commit to a single hypothesis that covers the entire instance space. Then we have instance-based learning methods, for example, kth nearest approach, where all instances correspond to the points in ND space, and the nearest neighbor are defined in the terms of Euclidean distance. And the Euclidean distance between two data points is measured, and the minimum, the distance is the nearest the neighbor is. So we call it KNN, kth nearest neighbor. So KNN for real value prediction for a given unknown tuple returns the mean values of the kth nearest neighbors. And we can also have a modified approach which is known as a distant weighted nearest neighbor algorithm. Okay, then there are several other classification methods. For example, genetic algorithm. And genetic algorithm is based on biological evolution, which was proposed by Charles Darwin in 18th century. So biological evolution means that the nature chooses the fittest to survive. If you have good genes in the parents, the child or the offspring will also have a good gene. For example, if you choose a very good cow and a very good bull, then the offspring calf will be also very good. So this algorithm mimics this biological evolution behavior, and it chooses different good solutions and try to find out better solution in the next generation. Then we have fuzzy set approaches which uses fuzzy logic, and these uses truth values between 0 and 1 to represent the degree of membership. So attribute values are converted into fuzzy values. For example, income X is assigned a fuzzy membership value to each of the discrete categories, low, medium or high. So 49K belongs to the medium income with fuzzy value of 0.15, but belongs to high income with a fuzzy value of 0.96. As you can see, just find the 49K point, and then you can find the low and high income values and the fuzzy values. So fuzzy membership values do not have the sum of 1, and they are applicable. Each applicable rule contribute to a vote of membership in the categories, and typically the truth values for each predicted category are summed, and these sum are then combined at the end. Then there are some additional topics regarding classification. For example, we have a problem of multi-class classification where the output classes are more than 2. Okay, so we need to have several methods. For example, the method 1 says 1 versus all, where we learn a classifier one at a time, and the second method is all versus all, where we learn a classifier for each pair of classes. And similarly, we have semi-supervised classification. So it has self-training and co-training. So self-training builds the classifier using the label data and use it to label the unlabeled data, and those with the most confident label prediction are added to the set of labeled data. Whereas co-training uses 2 or more classifiers to teach each other, and each learner uses a mutually independent set of features of each tuple to train a good classifier. Say F1, and then these F1 and F2 are used to predict the class label for the unlabeled data. Okay, then we have active learning, where the class labels are expensive to obtain. Active learner, for example, query human for labels, and the pool-based approach uses a pool of unlabeled data, and it can be evaluated using some learning curves and accuracy as a function of the number of instances queried. So research issue is how to choose the data tuples to be queried, and there are some other issues, for example, uncertainty sampling and avoidance space. Okay, in the last we have transfer learning, which has some conceptual framework. Transfer learning means that we extract knowledge from one or more sources task and apply that knowledge to the target task. So you extract knowledge from one or more source tasks and apply the knowledge to the target task. So the traditional learning build a new classifier for each new task, and in transfer learning we build a new classifier by applying existing knowledge learned from source tasks. Okay, so this summarizes the topic of classification, and next week we'll start with a new topic. So do you have any questions? I will also try to upload them today on the Blackboard. Okay, you can go through these lecture slides and go through them. These are easy topics. They are conceptual. We will not go into the mathematics in the final examination. Okay, so don't get afraid by looking into the mathematics. So just remember the basic concepts, and these are easy concepts. Yes, also I've enhanced the deadline for the assignment, and now the new deadline is 10th of November. Okay, sorry, 10th of December. I've increased the date for the assignment, so it is 10th. Yes, the new deadline is 10th now. Because I found that there are many assignments which we have to do this week, so I have increased the deadline for the assignment, and I have taken it to 10th of December now. Yes, we will try to make slides like this for like the midterm. We'll make like those in the final as well, inshallah. If you want to study early, you can start preparing for the midterm slides that I've given, and for the final we'll make at the end of the semester.